Today, I'm going to be talking about how to find your wedding photographer. This is someone that's going to be a very important part of your wedding day, of course. And I'm going to go over everything to look for and everything to keep in mind to find really the ideal match for you. Welcome to I'll Be There For You, the podcast that helps couples with their wedding photography planning with me, William of William Adwin Photography. I have photographed several hundred weddings throughout the years, and I wanted to bring all of that experience to you. So take a listen, make sure to follow, and thank you for stopping by. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in once again. And today we're going to be talking about how to find your photographer, your ideal wedding photographer. And I was debating between having this as the first episode and the actual first episode, which was the wedding photography timeline. And ultimately, I decided to start with the wedding photography timeline because it really is the foundation of the day. And it's kind of, I thought of the analogy of, even the best chef in the world, if they go into a restaurant, if they go into the kitchen and the kitchen's not prepared for them, it doesn't matter how good they are. To some degree, they're going to be limited to do what they have the potential of doing. So the same holds true with a photographer. If the timing isn't good, if the logistics aren't in order, whatever the case might be, the photographer, regardless of how good they are, can only do so much with what they're given. So that's why I started with timing. But now we will move on to finding your ideal photographer. And in the show notes, I'm going to have a link to my sites, which will kind of have a general outline of everything I'm going to be going over here. So to start, style. What's the photographer's style that you want? And there are many different kind of terms, buzzwords, whatever you want to call them. I would actually focus on trusting your eye. And what I mean by this is don't say specifically, I want and then enter buzzword, that kind of photographer. Because ultimately what can happen is the words that the photography industry uses to describe a certain style might not be the same words that you describe the same style. And I've learned this over the years. I've had couples use words to describe my work, and they're not the same words that I would use to describe my work. However, if we just use our eyes, my couples look at my pictures and they know that it's the style they want. And I don't use words anymore when I'm talking with my couples to describe my work because, again, words can be used differently and some things can be ambiguous. So look at pictures of photographers that you like. Don't worry about any necessary buzzword or, terminology for what it is. Just trust your eye and say, okay, this is just the look I'm going for. And that's a great place to start with your style. Now, related to style, there are some words that photographers will use to describe their approach. And approach and style, of course, are very similar. And I would also recommend getting, once it comes to the consultation, which we'll get into later, talking to the photographer then about their approach and ask them to describe their approach more in depth. Because if a photographer says, for example, I'm a documentary style photographer, there are many photographers that can use the same words, and then their approach to the wedding isn't actually the same. So I'm just using the term documentary photographer because there are some photographers that will use that term, and it sounds like, well, maybe they're just documenting everything all day and the whole day is photojournalism and there's no portraits and there's nothing organized in any manner like that. However, some documentary photographers have portraits that are obviously posed and composed, put together portraits in their portfolio, but they call themselves documentary photographers. Now, it doesn't mean they're not documenting for most of the day. And then there are other photographers that say they are a documentary photographer, and although this is very rare, there are photographers that literally, they might not say a word all day. The photographer says absolutely nothing all day. They are 100% a photojournalist and just a fly on the wall throughout the entirety of the day. But that's pretty rare. And most couples want, and of course family, want at least some portraits of, all of those important people that have come together, on that day of celebration. So if a photographer says, I'm a documentary style photographer, or whatever other terms they would use, honestly, trust your eye, visually speaking, for the look that you're going for. And then once you have a consultation with the photographer, just say, and if they don't on their own, I always explain my approach when I have consultations, but if the photographer during the consultation doesn't explain their approach, ask them to. Say, how do you photograph the getting ready pictures? How do you photograph, anything throughout the day? What does the behind the scenes look like? Then it doesn't matter what words they've used, how you've interpreted them or haven't interpreted them, if you're on the same page with the specific words being used. If they explain their approach to you, you'll have the best understanding of how they shoot, how they photograph the entire day. All right, so that's kind of the foundation of where you want to go. You don't want to spend time looking for photographers that just might have a different look than you want or a different approach than you want. So moving on from there, I want to say think about your budget. However, I also want to say that it's important to, of course, everyone has a budget. And whether your budget is, and for your entire wedding, whether the budget for your entire wedding is $1,000 or $1 million and everything in between, everyone has a budget. Even people that are wealthy, they still have some kind of budget for whatever vendor they have. Think about your budget in general, but the reason I'm not simplifying and saying just write down your budget, because after you talk to photographers, after you understand what they do or what they don't do, after you see their work, after you've met them, all of these things, everything that's related to them as a photographer could sway how much you want to invest. It's no different than anything else. Imagine never going out to eat to a restaurant. And this is a good analogy because, we all go out to eat on a regular basis. We know what that's like, but we don't all know what it's like to get married. We're not getting married every weekend and hiring a photographer and know what that's like. So without perspective of knowing exactly what something is like, we might not know how much we want to invest. And, so I would say, imagine never going out to eat, and then all of a sudden you go to this restaurant and you're just like, wow, I didn't know it could be this. I didn't know it could be this amazing. And 3 courses, 5 courses, 7 courses. Wow. Like I had no idea. I thought it was just like a bowl of soup, which of course it could be as well, depending on where you go. But if you just kind of said to yourself, I'm going to spend X amount on going out to this thing called a restaurant, and then you didn't really know what a restaurant could really be, that might change your opinion. Now, of course, at some point you still have a max budget. But the point I'm making is if you write down a very firm X amount in the beginning before you really learn about what photographers have to offer, you might miss out on a really great photographer. And ultimately, after talking to Photo and talking to all of your other vendors, you're also going to start to figure out, all right, well, where can I shift money? Maybe I want to spend more money on photography. Maybe, and it would break my heart, but maybe some people are like, what? I don't want to spend as much on photography, but either way, as you start researching all of your vendors and you start putting all the pieces together, your budget's going to sway. You can still spend the same amount of money for the total wedding, but your budget per vendor is going to sway depending on what you find value in. And you will find more value or less value in things the more you learn about them. So I hope that makes sense. What I'm saying is don't put a concrete budget for photography. You can have a general ballpark figure, but realize that after talking to the photographer, you might be swayed and really find the value in what they do. Okay, so kind of have the budget as a constant. It's constant, free-flowing throughout the entire process, and it could sway a bit. And yes, so we'll move on from there. So you want to research photographers and find your photographers. Well, how do you do that? Most of the time, a couple will have a venue and or a planner prior to finding their photographer. Now, not always, but and there's actually a few cases where I've been booked before anything else, and I even helped the couple find the perfect venue for them. And if it's far enough out and they have multiple dates available, and we can work out the scheduling and all that to make sure I'm available, it can certainly be done. But most of the time, your venue, your planner, those are vendors that you're probably going to have before your photographer. So they are an excellent place to start. Now, if you have a planner, a great planner, they're going to understand your wants and needs very well. And they can also cut through any buzzwords or hip lingo or whatever the case might be and just get right down to, I know this is the photographer that you're looking for. I know your vision, and these photographers or this photographer is just really who you want to talk to. The venue as well can really help you out. And the venue, of course, is also going to recommend photographers that have shot at the venue that you're getting married at. Now, a little bit of a side note, it is 100% not necessary for your photographer to have shot at your specific venue. So just realize that. Every year, every photographer out there is shooting at a new venue. So it's always going to be our first time at a venue at some point. That doesn't mean that they're not going to do as good of a job. I do know that there's some popular blogs out there that might say, your photographer has to have experience at your venue. That simply just isn't true. So just talk to your venue, talk to your planner. Now, if you have other vendors hired already at this point, there's a general order of things. Usually venue and planner is first, and then shortly after is photographer. However, you might have already found your ideal dress if you're wearing a dress, if there's a bride, or you found your ideal wardrobe, suit, tux. Maybe you fell in love with a florist a long time ago at another wedding and you booked them first before anything else. Whatever the case might be, there might be other vendors that you can talk to and ask them about photographers. So these vendors, they have a perspective that the outside world doesn't. They literally work, especially planners and venues, they literally see the photographers working. They know the behind the scenes, and they can really tell you so much about them. So that's a tremendously valuable source for you in finding your photographer. Now, of course, you can also talk to your friends who have been married already. Talk to them about their photographer. Did they like their photographer? And even if they really like their photographer, every photographer, every vendor, any job anyone ever has, it's impossible to always be a 10 out of 10. There's always room for improvement. So also, take advantage of the fact that your friend or family member might have perspective of maybe they hired a photographer and maybe like, the photographer was fantastic. Everything was great. 9.5 out of 10. I just kind of wish they did this, and I don't know what that is, but you can learn from them, so you could ultimately learn and pass that on to the photographer that you do want to hire. Just be like, it'll help you understand, your kind of checklist of the things that you're really looking for with your photographer and your end product of the photography. Now, another way to research is reviews. I would not recommend searching reviews on wedding planning platforms. And I'm saying this, and I actually have reviews on wedding planning platforms. The reason I'm saying that this isn't really the best, relatively speaking to Google, this isn't really the best place, because on a site for wedding planning, a vendor could, relatively speaking, somewhat more easily get a negative review removed. And so then you're kind of getting a framed, biased perspective of the actual photographer. I would recommend going to Google, because Google doesn't care if someone gave you a negative review. It's staying up there. And I'll actually say from personal experience, years ago, I got a very obvious fake review. It was spam. It said, "Turn to Jesus." So obviously that had nothing to do with my wedding photography business, anything at all. It was obviously spam, and it was very difficult for me to remove. I can't tell you how many times I had to reach out to Google. So if a photographer has a negative review on Google, and it's obviously about a client that they had, Google's not going to remove it. It doesn't matter how much they try. So look at Google. That's going to be the best platform for reviews. That's going to give you the best perspective. I would also say if a business has been open for years and they have 4 Google reviews and they've been running a business for a decade, that might be something to think about as well. It just seems kind of odd that someone would be running a business for that long and they don't really have a lot of reviews. That could not be a good thing. Because in general, a lot of people don't want to leave a bad review and they would rather just not leave a review at all, which could be telling for a vendor that doesn't have a lot of reviews. Now, of course, some people, if it's bad enough, they're not happy, understandably, and they're going to leave a negative review. But Google is a good place to go. Now, speaking of, a business running, ask your photographer if they are a full-time photographer. Now, this is not to put down any part-time photographers, because when I started out, I was a part-time photographer. And it's not an issue of a full-time photographer is who you should hire and a part-time photographer is not someone you should hire. The difference is just simply knowing what a full-time photographer can do for you and what a part-time photographer can or cannot do for you. So, for example, I am full-time and I have been for many years. That allows me to be available for emails, for phone calls, for text messages, pretty much any time. If I'm awake, I'm open. Those are my hours of operation. And some vendors will be like, oh, you need to have work-life balance. And I do, because my work-life balance is after I record this podcast, I'm going to go for a walk, and I just punched out. And then after that, if I want to punch back in and start working, I can. But, if my couples are working a 9-to-5 job, and, if I was part-time working a 9-to-5 job, when would we talk? There's limited time when we can talk and communicate. So if someone is working a 9-to-5 gig, a client, and they send me an email on their lunch break, I could respond, and I could also, I've done many engagement sessions on a Tuesday. And if I was working another job, I wouldn't be able to do that. So you will have more access to a photographer. They will be more responsive if they are full-time and this is their career as compared to if they're part-time. Again, this is not to put down any part-time photographer, and I like to think that I was a pretty damn good photographer when I was part-time. But simply, there's just limited availability with someone part-time. So just realize that going in. All right, so outreach. When you are reaching out to photographers, I would recommend, most people prefer to email, fill out a contact form on the photographer's websites. Some people will reach out on Instagram or direct message, whatever the case might be. Sometimes I get phone calls, not often. I wouldn't recommend a phone call. And the reason why is, it's best for you, even if you're fully prepared. If you're calling someone, you might not know how long the consultation is going to go. So if you have like 15 minutes or so and you're like, oh, I got lots of time to get information, and then you start getting in a consultation that wasn't, planned for. I talk to my couples for at least 30 minutes during a consultation and sometimes an hour. So I wouldn't recommend just randomly calling someone. Also, they might have a session or maybe they have a meeting in 30 minutes. So I would recommend emailing or messaging and not calling, and then just setting up a designated time and knowing how long the consultation is going to be. Now, every photographer isn't necessarily going to speak to a couple as long as I do. I know some photographers, they want to do it in like 15 minutes. For me, I think people deserve a little bit longer than that. My consultations will be up to about an hour, and that allows me to really understand their wants and needs and also explain my process to them. So I would recommend some kind of message, not phone call for starting off and getting information. But eventually you will want to set up a consultation, which I'll get into. Now, when you reach out to photographers, you want to make sure to ask to see full wedding galleries. And the reason you want to see full wedding galleries is because it gives you the most accurate perspective of what a photographer can do or cannot do on a wedding day. It also allows you to see what their, kind of back to approach and style. Forget the words, just trust your eyes. You can look at their entire gallery. You can just go to the getting ready pictures and see what that looks like. You can go to the ceremony, which maybe it's an outdoor ceremony at a vineyard, and you can see what that looks like. You can see what the portraits of the family look like. Or maybe there aren't any. But I mean, again, 99% of the time, more than that, couples and family want that. But whatever the case might be, it'll give you perspective of seeing everything. Highlights on social media and a website are certainly great as an introduction. However, you can look at 2 photographers, or you can look at 5 photographers' portfolios, and they might look like they're all at the same skill set and level of experience. And then if you see a full gallery of 1,000 images or more, you're going to start seeing a difference. And I guarantee they won't all be at the same level. So just keep that in mind. That's going to give you the best perspective. And if a photographer is not willing to show you full galleries, I would move on because that's just not a good sign if they're not willing to share a full gallery with you. Under the extremely rare exception that every single wedding they shoot has an NDA, which just means that those pictures can't be shared with anyone and the couple requests privacy. But that's extraordinarily rare. Most photographers aren't working with clients every single wedding that say, we don't want our pictures shared with anyone ever. So make sure to get a full gallery. If for some strange reason this is a very high-profile photographer, again, they might not be able to show you full galleries, maybe. But even then, I think after years of shooting, I would find it hard to believe if they didn't have at least something full wedding gallery to show you. So moving on from there, you're going to want to know, of course, we talked about budget earlier. When you reach out to them, you're going to want to know what they're charging in general. Now, every photographer works differently. Some photographers will send you a price list and they'll have different packages on it. Other photographers will say, I have a starting price point. And some photographers will not send you any pricing at all. You ultimately have to decide what works best for you. I think the philosophy of not sending any pricing at all could potentially waste everyone's time, because if your maximum budget, even with being swayed with the perfect photographer, is say $5,000 for photography and the photographer starts at $10,000, then you're just wasting your time, And planning a wedding, of course, even with a planner, it's enduring. It's not enduring. That's the wrong word. It's time consuming. But having a planner, again, would help you with this. The planner would know the budget of these photographers. But if a photographer isn't giving you any price whatsoever, you could certainly still follow through, but just realize that it might be a waste of your time, because you have no idea what their budget actually is, what their price point is, I should say, and if it matches your budget. Now, for photographers that say starting at could be fine as long as you know what that includes. So some photographers will say starting at X amount, but then they don't say what that includes. And so that's not really helping you. But if they say starting at and it includes X, Y, Z, and we're going to go over collections and packages in just a moment, if it says starting at and it includes, then that is helpful. And then again, there are some photographers that just send out their entire collection. What I do is I have 2 packages. I keep it very simple. It covers most weddings, and then I have a la carte options in addition to that. I don't want to waste anyone's time, and people want to know what they're investing in and the general ballpark of it. So I will certainly send that out to couples. So those are just some things to keep in mind for pricing that you're going to get or not get from a photographer when you reach out. So once you get information for the photographer, there are some things to keep in mind and to go over, actually a good amount of things to go over in terms of what's in the collection. Now, some photographers call them collections, some photographers call them packages, whatever you want to call it. It's the itemized options that are coming with whatever you're paying for. So these things include some of or all of the following. First, engagement session. Most people call it an engagement session, at least where I am. I'm in Northeast United States, studio based out of New York. Most people in this area will call it an engagement session. Other parts of the country or world, they might call it something different. But essentially what it is, it's a photography session before the wedding day. And I highly, highly recommend these, by the way. Now, not every one of my couples will get them, but 95% of my couples do. And the reason I recommend them is basically it's a warm-up for the wedding day in terms of it allows the photographer to see how you and your partner are in front of the camera. It allows you and your partner to know what the photographer is like behind the camera. And as much as a photographer can explain their approach to you, this is not something that you do every weekend. You don't have a more involved photo shoot every weekend. So a photographer can explain what they do to you, but you still haven't experienced it. So this is something that you want to experience and know. And again, it allows the photographer to understand, kind of your approach or how you are in front of the camera. And some couples are a little more introverted, are a little more shy. They might need a little more encouragement or direction. I find most of my couples do need direction to some degree. Very, very few couples will not need any kind of direction. And I'll also say this, just in terms of direction in general, a photographer, in my opinion, should be giving direction at some point to some degree with any kind of portrait, because the chance of you on your own, or you and your partner, or you and a group of people just magically falling into good light and falling into a good composition and all of these things that make for a really great picture, these things just don't happen on their own. Now, photojournalism is a completely different story. That's capturing the moments, and ideally you want to have good light and all that, but you're not lighting every single candid moment, and that's just not even possible. So not to get too off track, but basically engagement session is definitely worth your time, and it's something that you want to do. Now, find out how long the engagement session is. I do 2 hours. Some couples or some photographers might do less, some might be more. I do 2 hours. I find 2 hours is plenty of time to get a nice variety of pictures. And also it's just time to kind of build a rapport with your photographer, which is really important. Find out if the engagement session has any limits in terms of travel. So for example, like I will include an engagement session within 2 hours travel of New York City. And if there's I certainly am willing to go farther than that, but then farther than that, dependent on how far, there would be additional cost for travel. So also just find out if there's a travel fee, find out how far from whatever city center you're able to go for the engagement session. Moving on to the actual photography for the wedding day, how many hours are you getting? And now, keep in mind, if a photographer says 10 hours, these are 10 consecutive hours. No photographer is going to shoot for 5 hours, stop shooting for 2 hours, and then shoot for another 5 hours, because that's 12 hours. It's not 10 hours. So keep that in mind with your planning, because it's the photographer's time. So whether we're shooting or we're moving to another place where we will be shooting, that's all part of the hours of coverage. But find out how many hours you need, and your photographer should help you with this, or your planner. Now, when I have consultations with couples, I will get to know their wants and needs, and then I'm never going to say, well, you need more hours of coverage than you really need. I'm not going to do that. So, but that's why I offer 10 hours and 12 hours, which 10 hours actually covers pretty much every wedding. Some weddings might need 12 hours. However, a couple can also do 10 hours and then add 1 hour a la carte and essentially have an 11-hour day. But in general, for a 1 day, and you can listen to my first episode for this, in general, for a 1 day wedding event, 10 hours is usually it covers most bases, and you can get the entirety of the wedding day story told most of the time. But know how many hours are included in the package. Know if there's a second shooter or assistant, and what is the difference. I won't shoot a wedding without a second photographer. I have had couples ask me, they're like, oh, can we save money if we don't have a second photographer? I will never, ever do that. Now, do I have the capability of shooting a wedding by myself? Of course I have. And I actually have done it in the past, but it's not something I do anymore. And the reason is, this is your wedding day. I can twist my ankle and not be able to walk, on my way to out the door from the getting ready pictures, and the show must go on. I mean, I might crawl and take pictures, but, there's only so much I can do with that. I always have a second photographer with me. And while my second photographer and what I define as a second photographer is not, if I'm shooting lead, they're not responsible for a lot of things. However, if I go down, if I break my ankle, whatever the case might be, my second photographer and all of my second photographers are experienced photographers that have shot their own weddings, have their own businesses, so they, rest assured, can take over. I highly recommend having a second photographer. I do not ever recommend hiring a photographer that does not have a second photographer. And that photographer can say all they want, oh, well, I can have a photographer on call, but that photographer's not there. Even if they have their gear packed and they're sitting in their car, especially if you're in New York, depending on where, it could be hours until someone gets there. Even if it's an hour, that could be the entire duration of the ceremony. So I always include a second photographer. I would recommend that you always have a second photographer. Now, an assistant is someone that, and make sure you get the meaning from the photographer, because some photographers will say assistant, but the assistant actually does do some picture taking, which doesn't sound like someone that's shooting because it's an assistant. But either way, make sure you get the definition of what they mean from the photographer. Most people, when they say second photographer, it means they are, of course, taking pictures, but they're not shooting the lead. They don't have most of the responsibility of the day. And most people, when they say assistant, they simply mean someone that's not shooting and carrying gear, getting people water, something to drink, helping with whatever the case might be. It's an extra set of helping hands. That's what an assistant is. So let's see, moving on, looking at my notes. Some photographers in their collection will have the option of a rehearsal dinner coverage. That could be the day before. You ultimately could decide if you want that photographed or not. Some photographers will offer brunch after, if the wedding is on a Saturday, the brunch would be Sunday morning. And this is for weddings that are usually, for the most part, 1 day. Now, there are weddings that could be 3 or 4 days long, depending on the culture, depending on the location, depending on the client. But I'm covering what is the norm and common for me and for a lot of photography. Most weddings are 1 day, with the exception of certain cultures like South Asian weddings, which tend to be multiple days. But I personally don't photograph them. As beautiful as the culture is, I haven't really got inquiries for that. I would love to, though. So if you're a South Asian couple and you're getting married, I would love to photograph your wedding. So, but rehearsal dinner, brunch, those are options. Moving on from there, are you getting digital pictures? Are you getting film? Are you getting both? There's no right or wrong way to do it. Most photographers don't really shoot much film anymore. However, some photographers do. I shoot all digital at this point, but some photographers will offer a hybrid. But just know what you're getting and, of course, how they're delivered. I offer digital photography, and all of the pictures are uploaded to an online gallery. So that's what I do. I don't think photographers really do like USBs anymore. That's kind of antiquated, but they might. My digital images photography are on an online gallery. Now you want to make sure, or you want to see, I'm trying to be objective here. You want to see if the pictures that you're getting, the digital pictures, are high res or if they're just website, web resolution. Some photographers will give you the high res. Some photographers will just give you the web res. And so the web resolution images you can't really print because they're just for digital display. The high res images, of course, you can print because they're the high resolution full size images. I personally give the high res images. That's my approach. Now you also want to know if the images are watermarked. I don't really know any photographer that watermarks your pictures anymore. Maybe there's some out there, but I don't really see that, and I don't know why any couple would want their wedding pictures watermarked. It just doesn't make sense to me. But just in case, ask. And ultimately you can decide if you want watermarked wedding pictures from your photographer or not. Now, are you getting color pictures or are you getting black and white? Are you getting both? And who decides? I give a color and a black and white of every single picture. So if I'm delivering, say, 1,000 pictures, they're actually going to get 2,000 files because there's a color and a black and white of each. Now, some photographers will only do color. Some photographers will do every image color and then they'll just choose a few black and whites. I don't do that because what can end up happening is you might see the pictures and you're like, wow, this is a really beautiful moment in black and white. However, I would like to see it in color as well, and my flowers are in it, or whatever the case might be. And then there might be a little bit of back and forth, and the photographer might have the philosophy of, well, I'm the photographer, I'm choosing, and this is part of my art, or whatever the case might be. I give a color and a black and white of everything. Then ultimately you can choose what you like, and there is so much of the artistic side in it already. To me, it doesn't matter if it's color or black and white on your end. I'm going to choose what I want to show in my portfolio, of course, but I give in color and black and white to everyone, and then you got everything. And what's interesting, as time goes by, some couples start looking at their black and whites more. And they'll post their black and whites more, which is interesting. And some couples just love black and white to begin with, and other couples, they don't really like the black and white at all, but they're there as an option if they ever change their mind. And are you getting printing rights? That's something to think about. And I include printing rights. I don't really know any photographers that don't include printing rights. Now, this is not the same thing as a copyright. A copyright means someone owns the picture. Now, photographers aren't going to give the copyright out to a couple, but that doesn't mean that you can't print. So if a photographer says to you, you don't get the copyright, all that means is that you didn't create the image and that you can't make all of the decisions around that photograph. So what does that mean? That means, if there's a picture of you and your partner or you on your wedding day, and you can't just sell that image to a wedding website or something like that, and without talking to the photographer. So that's really all that means. And from a technical standpoint, whoever takes the picture, as soon as they push the shutter, they have the copyright. But that doesn't mean you can't print them, and it doesn't mean you can't share them on social media. It just means you can't sell them, and there would need to be a conversation. But I don't really know why any couples would be selling their pictures, but you never know. So that's what that means. So you want to find out if you have printing rights. I give printing rights. However, I also do sell prints to my couples and their family and friends, which of course I highly recommend because they're really great quality prints as compared to just getting a print from somewhere else, which may or may not be a good quality, may or may not be archival. So moving on from there, albums. Some photographers will include an album in your collection. Some photographers will make them a la carte. I am a la carte. I used to include an album in every single collection. However, I found as time went on, and as much as it breaks my heart, but I'm not going to force people to get a tangible printed product. Some photographers really want everyone to have an album, and that's fine. I am not going to, especially as time goes on and more people are growing up in the digital age, as much as I encourage print and I love print and holding on to something is much different than looking at it on your computer, I'm not going to tell people that they have to get an album. So I don't include an album, but I have albums a la carte, and ultimately couples can decide if they want them. And I'd say a good amount, about half of my couples, 50% of my couples do get albums. So that's something else to see. Do you want an album? Does the photographer include it? That's something else to keep in mind with their collections, with their packages. Now, in terms of the album, if you are having your entire wedding day photographed, so from the getting ready pictures through the ceremony and all the way through the reception events and to the end of the day, in my experience of photographing hundreds and hundreds of weddings, to do it in a tasteful, pleasing way, visually speaking, you need at least 40 pages in an album. If you are getting a 20-page album and you want your entire wedding day story told, you're going to have too many pictures, in my opinion, on pages. It's going to be cluttered. It's not something that's going to work. Or what will happen is, and you want to ask questions. Some photographers will include an album with every collection, and they'll say, you get a 20-page album. Ask them to see what a 20-page album looks like. Because what can happen is you're thinking to yourself, okay, I'm getting an album. And then you realize later that a 20-page album really isn't enough to tell the entire wedding day story. And then you're going to have to buy additional spreads. And that's completely fine, but you need to know that from the beginning. And unfortunately, some photographers don't explain that. And so essentially what they're doing is they're putting couples in a position where they think they're getting something, and then if they actually want the full thing, they have to spend more money. And I have no problem with a business trying to get people to spend more money. Of course, that's what we all do. We can't stay in business without it, but I believe in being 100% transparent. So just realize if you're getting an album and there's not a lot of pages in it, and you want your entire wedding to be told, your entire wedding story to be told, you're going to need more pages, and so it is going to be more of an investment. Now, if you're okay with a 20-page album that only shows some of the wedding day, then that's totally fine. But just envision how you want your album to be, and in my experience, you're going to need at least 40 pages or more, but at least 40 pages to tell the entire wedding day story. Moving on from there, so photographers will have a la carte options. These a la carte options we've kind of gone over. Every photographer is different, but usually you have your base collection, which is your hours of photography on the wedding day. And then some people will break up the a la carte into, like what we talked about, an engagement session might be a la carte, albums, rehearsal dinner, brunch the next day coverage, things like that. Those could be a la carte. However, they also might be built in to the collections. Every photographer will do it a little bit differently, but these are all kind of the building blocks for you to keep in mind. Now, after your wedding day, but I mean, hopefully your photographer will talk to you about this before if they do this. Some photographers will do what's called a reveal session. And what a reveal session is, this is something they do in person with you. They will, once all of your wedding pictures are done, they will show you, they will reveal them to you in a slideshow, whatever the case might be. And I will be 100% honest with you, in the behind the scenes photography world, there are photographers that very much like doing these reveal sessions, and there are photographers that very much don't like doing these reveal sessions. And the issue is, and my purpose is to help you as a couple. I know some photographers aren't going to agree or like what I'm going to say here, but I am here to help you. So you have to know what the reveal session is. And to be honest, the reveal session is also, of course, a sales session. And there's nothing wrong with that. We as photographers, our businesses, we need to make money. And of course, we're going to try to upsell and make more money. As long as you know what the reveal session is before going into it, then you're completely fine. The issue and the gray area is one photographer really explaining what the session is, or are they not? So for example, one photographer might be, the reveal session is, and you've already gotten an album and it's, an appropriate amount of pages. One photographer's reveal session, and this is 100% great and helpful, and I 100% stand behind it. One photographer's reveal session will be, I've shown you all the pictures and, we celebrate. It's great. I'm going to help you put the pictures into an album form, and we can digitally see what the layout of the album is and what every spread is, and we'll start from here, and maybe when we want to switch this picture, and maybe we want this spread to be black and white, and all right, that's perfect, everything looks great, and oh, you know what, let's add this spread. I forgot, we have all these beautiful details, let's add this spread here. That's great. And the photographer there is there to help you, and that's totally fine. And if that is what the photographer explained to you, that the reveal session is, then that's perfect. And if you want to add album spreads, whatever the case might be, to have a larger album, that's totally fine too, as long as the initial album is enough to tell the whole wedding day story, like I was mentioning earlier. What isn't so great is what some photographers, and this isn't to repel you from any kind of in-person reveal session. This is really to manage your expectations and allow you to know what does happen sometimes. Sometimes what some photographers will do is be like, hey, here's a reveal session, and they don't really explain what it is, or they might just say, it's when I just show you the pictures. But really what they are going to be doing is try to sell you some tangible items, some printed products, whatever the case might be, which again is fine, but you need to know what you're going into. And some photographers will do everything they can not to really share with couples what's about to happen. And so couples can be put in an unprepared situation, an awkward situation, sometimes a high pressure sales situation that they don't want to be in. So if your photographer does some kind of in-person post session, just know what it is and what it isn't. That's all I'm saying. Some photographers have gone as far as printing an entire album for a couple, even though the couple never asked for an album and they didn't want an album. And then the photographer will put the album in their hands and make a real high pressure sales situation for the couple. I think that's unethical. I don't agree with that at all. Some photographers will disagree with me. That's fine. I don't care. Again, this is so you know what's going on. Again, nothing wrong with any kind of in-person event after the wedding. Just know what it is and what it isn't. All right. So moving on from there. After you've found some photographers, some possible photographers that kind of line up with your wants and needs, and you've done everything that we've talked about, you've researched and kind of all the building blocks of what they're offering, you're going to want to very highly recommend have a Zoom session with them. Your photographer is someone that is going to literally be following you around for 10 hours or maybe longer. So of course the photography is important. Their approach is important, which you should talk about, as I mentioned earlier, during the Zoom session, but their personality is tremendously important. So you might find a photographer and their pictures are just perfect. You looked at their entire wedding galleries that they've sent and they are just flawless, everything you're looking for. And maybe you're a very kind of reserved, conservative couple, which is totally fine. Everyone is different. And then you meet the photographer and they're super, super high energy. Is that someone you want with you throughout the day? And I would venture to guess no. And on the other, let's completely flip that as well. Maybe you're super, super high energy, like you are just 100% all day long, super high energy, love joking around, having fun. And you meet a photographer and they're like, hello, yes. My name is William Adwin and I'm here to photograph pictures. They're just very, very quiet, very reserved. it's not going to really match your energy. So find someone that has the personality you're looking for. I would describe myself as somewhere in between. I'm not crazy high energy, but I'm also not super reserved. I'm somewhere, I guess my personality is pretty diplomatic, I guess, which was a good thing for me, because I do get some couples that are more reserved, and I'll also make a point of turning it down a little bit, but I'm not going to be someone that I'm not. And I don't think any photographer should be. And then if I have a couple that's a little more high energy, I'll turn it up a little bit, but I am who I am, and any other photographer is who they are. So just make sure that your personalities match. And when you're having your consultation, when you're having your Zoom session, ask them, if they don't explain to you, what their approach is. How do they approach the entire wedding day? Is it 100% hands-off the entire time, which I really doubt it. But when they are hands-on, when they are giving direction, how much are they giving direction? Is it a little bit of direction? Is it kind of a moderate amount of direction? Or is everything completely perfectly posed, down to every single fingertip and everything in between? And what do you want and what do you not want? I will say, for me, I give direction when it's needed, and I know that it will improve a photograph. Now, direction really only comes with portraits. So this is portraits of the couple, wedding party, and family. I'm not going to give someone direction during their vows. I am a fly on the wall. I am 100% observing and capturing the moments. I'm not going to tell a couple to smile at the camera during their first dance. Now, some photographers do this. Not most, but some photographers do, and that's fine. But just know the approach so that you really understand everything, going into the wedding day. And when you're having your consultation, make sure your photographer is getting to know about you, learning about you. If a photographer just gets right into themselves and it's really about themselves, that's probably not a good photographer for you. You want a photographer that can listen. You want a photographer that wants to know about you and your wants and needs and your vision and what you're looking for from photography. So that's tremendously important. I would just observe how the consultation goes. And if you feel that the consultation was mostly about the photographer, you might want to choose someone else. Now, with the exception, if you're very quiet and the photographer has no option but to kind of carry the conversation, that could be different. But I'm just saying in general, make sure that your photographer is genuinely getting to know about you. And that's tremendously important. So moving on from there, of course, you want to make sure that once you've decided on your photographer, you want to make sure to have a contract. There's also nothing wrong with looking over a contract before you make a decision, because after all, this is your wedding day. And whether it's your photographer or any other vendor, you want to make sure to have a contract 100%. Always have a contract. Even if it's a friend doing a favor, which I don't know if I would have a friend be a vendor, because that could be different. It could be difficult for you to view them as a vendor. It could be difficult for them to view you as a client, just from a psychological standpoint. Either way, get a contract. That's tremendously important. Now, a few things to keep in mind on your photography contract that are really important is make sure that the photography package, the photography collection that you got is itemized and laid out in the contract. You want to make sure the turnaround time for the photography is outlined in the contract. Payment schedule, you want to make sure is outlined in the contract. Most payment schedules, by the way, are 50-50. 50% at the signing of the contract, and then 50% due by the wedding day. Some photographers might say a month before the wedding day. Whatever the case might be, it's usually like 50-50. And then what if the photographer isn't able to photograph your wedding? What happens then? Now, I did talk about earlier why I have a second photographer. If for some reason, I talked about how I might break my ankle on the wedding day, but what if I get, I don't know, something happens to me before I get to the wedding day? My second photographer is taking a separate car. They're meeting me there. So even if I can't get to the wedding day, rest assured you still have a photographer. but find out what other photographers will do in case someone doesn't show up, or if the photographer shoots solo. Then what happens? And if they can't get someone to substitute, what happens then? So those are important factors in the contract for sure. So I think that pretty much covers everything. So thank you so much for tuning in, and make sure to follow and make sure to share with anyone planning their wedding, as I'm sure this will be helpful information for them. And we will see you next time.